So these past couple days, I think the Lord's given me just some beautiful encounters with different people, particularly people in the millennial generation. And something that I really appreciate in these encounters is to hear a particular perspective that is quite beautiful. Sometimes we can fault younger generations for either not coming to Mass or not doing this or not doing this, and those are things that they need to grow into. But sometimes we can kind of brush them aside and say, well, they aren't really, really wanting to follow the Lord. And yet, when I was listening to these young people in different contexts, one thing that I heard was this deep desire, a sensitivity towards other people in the human family, and a desire to listen, to understand where this person is coming from who might be very different than them, but then also to do something, serve, to make a difference in a real hands-on sort of way. And you see that just within the younger population now that are young adults, that there's this deep desire of giving towards charitable causes or doing different kinds of things that help people in difficult world situations, that are poor, that are oppressed, or just various different things. And sometimes maybe the negative element of our culture can sort of hijack that and sort of transform that into maybe a direction that sometimes it shouldn't go. But there is something deep down that's quite beautiful of this heart that wants to serve, a heart that wants to not just talk the talk, but walk the talk. And there's these two expressions that it's important to have both of them in our lives: orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Orthodoxy is right teaching, correct belief. Orthopraxy is the right way to act, to live your life. And we see sometimes we can focus on one to the exclusion of the other. We can charge forward wanting to help others, but maybe not knowing the depth of what it means to help in such a way that we lift up the person according to the way that Christ is calling us to. Or we might maybe focus on, this is the right thing to do, this is the right thing to do, and yet we don't actually lift a finger to do anything about it. And that's one of the areas that a lot of the young people of the millennial culture, Generation Z and all of those, when they are looking at the church and they are saying, when we're saying, well, why aren't you here? Why aren't you coming? A lot of times their experience is, I don't see you living out what you say you believe. And in many ways, we can be like the priest or the Levite, who in a sense knows the right teaching, but we kind of walk on the other side when there's a real issue, when there's a real need, when someone is suffering, and we kind of walk over saying, well, I'm just going to get to my group or my Bible study or, my different thing like that. And those things are important. We need those things. But we have to look into our lives, and I'm preaching to myself too, because sometimes I can kind of get into a bubble and not take that courageous reaching out to help those who are on the fringes of society that maybe we forget about because we're kind of enclosed in church world. And it's comfortable in church world, but it gets messy. And this is, I think, where that wisdom of Pope Francis, who takes inspiration from St. Francis of Assisi, that sense of, he says, that I want a church who's willing to have their feet dirty in mud because they're going out and they're embracing the beggar on the streets than being isolated and insulated within the cleanliness of the church walls. And that's something for us to really take to heart. And it doesn't mean going in such a way that we just throw away our teaching, our belief, all those different things. But we have to maybe look and see, even as a parish or even as Catholics, are we living out merely just this is what we're supposed to do, or are we actually going out to those persons that are hurting, who maybe also think very, very differently than us? And are we willing to have the courage to listen, to understand their experience, and to love them in the midst of that messiness? That's what our young people, many of them, are looking towards. Are we a church that is living out the call to take care of the poor, the needy within our world? And a great thing to think about is the question of, if St. Mary's was just swallowed up by a hole in the ground, a sinkhole, and we just disappeared, would our larger community, not just our parishioners, but the larger community, even notice? Something to really think about. If we just cease to exist, would the rest of society just move on as though nothing happened? Or would there be felt a huge hole of this people who reached out and were the ones when someone was hurting, when someone was grieving, when the poor were in need, when mothers were seeking help for their unborn child, for immigrants who are coming to this country and don't know where to turn, for the refugees of Afghanistan who are coming to this country? Are we there for them in different ways? Are we living out those corporal works of mercy? That's what the Good Samaritan is about. The Good Samaritan, he didn't have originally orthodoxy. A Samaritan was someone who had sort of a mix. They kind of believed aspects of the Jewish faith, but then they also brought in other things as well. And so he didn't have everything together, and yet he was the one who actually did the orthopraxy. He actually served the person who was in need, and he was treating that person with mercy. And Jesus says, look to his example. Versus the priest and the Levite, who have the orthodoxy, they have the correct teaching, but when push comes to shove, they just walk around the area of need. And so it's a challenge for all of us to make sure that we're being fed by the scriptures and they are forming a correct teaching within our heart, but they're also forming this desire and passion to hurt for the hurts of others and to be impelled, like St. Francis, to reach out and embrace the leper, the beggar, to live that life totally for others, which can only happen when we are totally first for the Lord. Let's ask St. Francis's intercession for each of us, for our families, and for this church community, that we could really delve deeper into living out the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, so that especially the younger generations, they can discover the face of Christ lived out in action and not only just in word.